Hey, I'm Dr. Gerry Crete. Welcome to Post-Traumatic Growth. Thrilled to have you with us. Today's guest is Greg Willits. He has tons of experience. He was in Catholic media. He was on Sirius Radio. He runs Rosary Army, which has its own podcast. He has an incredible journey, and he recently came out with a book, God Doesn't Hate Me After All. And he integrates his journey of mental health growth with his faith and devotion in St. Louis de Montfort. So in this interview with Greg, we're going to talk about his journey, his faith integration, his experience with trauma therapy, in particular EMDR. We'll also talk a little bit about narrative therapy. So join us. Look forward to having you with us. Please leave comments if you have any, and check out Elijah Institute's trainings as well. So excited today to be joined by Greg Willits. Greg, great to have you.
Thanks, Gerry.
Yeah, you have a great, amazing history being, the first one in Catholic media to be on Sirius Radio, and you've been running Rosary Army, but you've just come out with a new book. What is it? God Doesn't Hate Me After All?
God Doesn't Hate Me After All. And then the subtitle is Discovering Louis de Montfort's Love of Eternal Wisdom, which is the whole reason why I wrote it is because of that book.
Okay, well, that's great. Well, I hope we can get into that one.
Yeah, sure.
This podcast, it's about looking at the broken glass of our lives and seeing the beauty. I'm stealing from a line from K-pop Demon Hunters when I say that. It's an amazing song, but I thought you might appreciate it.
I have yet to partake of the K-pop Demon Hunters. I've avoided
so you're a
it.
Captain Carrot fan, but you don't know the Demon Hunters.
I know who they are. I've never gotten into the Korean animation. I'm old school, like 1980s DC comic book type of.
Well, I am too.
Graphics.
But I was made to watch it actually, and I was pleasantly surprised at the message that it had to say about trauma. Actually, but
oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
It really gets into the
it.
idea that things that we hide, things that we try to pretend didn't happen, hurt us if we hide them, and what it means to actually be yourself and bring those into the light and actually have healing and growth, and which is kind of what we wanted to talk about. I mean, one of the things I always admire about you, Greg, is your willingness to be open about your own story, and I think you do that in your book, right? And you share a lot about your own trauma, your own healing journey. I mean, would you be okay to give us a little background about your experience, your journey?
Yeah. I'd never talked about it before until about 8 years ago when everything fell out from underneath me. For years, so Jennifer and I, just to correct the intro a little bit, so we weren't the first Catholic media people on Sirius. There were a lot of other people that kind of paved that road for us. But we were the first, our Rosary Army Apostolate was the first Catholic organization to ever have a podcast.
Oh, okay.
So I always joke and say we beat the Vatican by 2 weeks. So because 2 weeks after our show launched, the Vatican launched Vatican Radio. But we've been so blessed to do so many different things in Catholic media for the last 20 plus years. And so the podcast started in March of 2005. So like this month as we're recording this, it's been 21 years that we've been podcasting, which just is ridiculous. My wife and I have been married. This year will be 31 years. We've been podcasting for 2/3 of our marriage. We've been married for 3 decades. So it's like, that's just insane to us that, we've been doing it for as long. Our 5 kids don't remember life without mom and dad, sharing stuff on the microphone. So we did always share a lot of things, but my mental health was always the taboo subject that we wouldn't discuss. A lot of that, to your point, was buried and hidden and kept it shoved down. And in many ways pretended it wasn't an issue. And it wasn't until in 2017, for the job I had at the time, a series of workplace traumas happened that at the time I thought it was all about the workplace, but through subsequent years of intense EMDR therapy and walking through a lot of things, learning very clearly that kind of for lack of a better term, breakdown that happened at that job place in 2017, early 2018. I ended up going on short-term disability, ended up in an intensive outpatient program for a few months, was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, in addition to the generalized anxiety disorder and, depression that I had already been dealing with for so many years, that it became evident that a lot of the traumas that had come to the surface were old traumas and not necessarily new ones. Mm. And that took me a long time to understand, and even longer to start accepting, because it broke open the narrative that I had been telling myself for so long. And it changed the narrative, I should say. It changed the narrative I'd been telling myself for so long. It made me realize that a lot of the things that I had experienced and brushed off from early in life, it was doing me no favors in doing that. And so a lot of that story ended up, I hesitated telling it, but quite honestly, we were pushed to it, because when I went on short-term disability in 2018, my wife and I were somewhat dependent upon, we used Patreon at that time. We don't use it anymore, but Patreon, so we had supporters of our podcast. And if I just disappeared from podcasting, we weren't going to have that revenue, and we desperately needed it when I was on short-term disability. But at the same time, I knew people at my job listened to the show too. And so I'm like, well, do I explain that I'm now on disability for mental health issues? And we just realized we just have to tell the story. Mm. And we started uncovering it. Then I ended up resigning from that job a couple months later. There was no way I was going to be able to go back to it. And so that really began. We moved back to Georgia about a year after that. So we've been back here in Georgia for a little over 7 years now. And in that 7 years, that's been the period of, and I was telling you a little bit before we started recording, our Rosary Army apostolate has been around since 2003. God just does the weirdest things in all the best ways of protecting us and guiding us and leading us in the direction that he needs us to. And it's almost like he was keeping this ministry, this apostolate, operating at the best level that I was able to run it. And as I've gotten better and I have experienced more healing, he's adding more back into it again, right? So whereas at one point we were on Sirius XM and we were very, very busy and there was a lot of visibility on our apostolate, he let it get hidden for a while, right? And we even see in Scripture where he does that, right? He makes things hidden until the appropriate time. And so it was literally a year ago this week, so it's been a rapidly fast lifespan for this book, that I sent an email to the acquisitions editor at Sophia Institute Press and said, listen, I've been thinking for a while about, I've been wanting to write a book that will make the 300-year-old treatise from St. Louis de Marie de Montfort called The Love of Eternal Wisdom, make it accessible to a modern-day audience. And, so I said, that's one idea. The other idea I have is to share this trauma from the perspective of a Catholic who very much needed God in his life to be able to get healed or to begin that pathway of healing. But even though we'd been talking about it now on our podcast since 2018 or so, am I the one to tell the story? Am I the one, because to tell the story, I had to reveal a lot of my most embarrassing things. My children were going to learn things about their dad that they never knew. And it was really opening up in the most transparent and vulnerable way that I've ever done. And what was amazing was, again, it was like this week I sent that email, immediately got a phone call, and the acquisitions editor said something that, well, you're probably familiar with Gene Luen Yang, who's a writer for comic books and graphic novels, and he did like American Born Chinese. He's currently writing Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Gene and I have been virtual friends since the beginning of Rosary Army, because at the same time Rosary Army launched, he did a Rosary comic book. That was kind of like his Lenten penance. He did this comic book and it got published. And so that we reached out, and Gene was actually the very first person I ever interviewed on a podcast 20 plus years ago. Well, in 2023, I think it was, he was in town for a speaking engagement, and he and I got together for dinner, and he asked me if I was writing any books. And I told him what I just told you, those two ideas I had. And he was the first person that says, well, why don't you make them both? Why don't you combine them? Why don't you combine de Montfort with your story? And that was the first time I ever heard it. I fought with it for a while, couldn't do it. Then last February, pitched it to the publisher, and they said the same thing. Why don't you combine those two? And so I spent 2 weeks. I wrote an introduction and a sample chapter, sent it to them, and within 2 weeks, they gave me a contract. I finished the book at the end of June, and it was published in November, and it's been out now for several months, and the impact has been very pleasing. I call it it's my version of Augustine's Confessions, because I can't think of much that I left out. And part of it was, if I'm going to write this book, I'm in my mid 50s. I might still be around for another 40 years, but we just had, in the Catholic world, a man who's had a lot of impact died this week. Dr. Paul Thigpen, at 71. You feel the clock ticking. And so if I'm going to make an impact for the church, this might be what God has been building me up to for such a time as this, to share this story so that people would have the courage to share their own story and to see where Jesus was in their own story.
Yeah. So that's a pretty radical vulnerability then. What have you found to be the fruit of that?
A little bit of it is still waiting to see long-term outside fruit. I hear a lot from people who know people who are suffering, and they want them to read the book. They want them to feel they want them to experience what I've experienced.
But what about for you?
And that's understandable, right?
You? Like when
with the fruit. Well, but the fruit for me, it's interesting because there are still wounds that exist on the family level. That once I started to name the wounds, it wasn't always welcomed by those who caused the wound. And in my book, my wife was excellent at saying, if I was naming something, I had to be respectful of the dignity of other people. It's not my job to name the sins of other people, even if they wounded me deeply. So there's a few nuances that I named the wound, but I didn't necessarily name the source of the wound, if that makes sense. The people responsible. And I think that's a very wise approach, because I just finished reading the book The Courage to be Disliked, which I found it kind of difficult to read just for various reasons, but it was good in that I liked the idea of separating of tasks. My task is to try to get better, to live my life as a Catholic, to do this ministry that God has entrusted me with, so that I can have an impact on the lives of other people. But the constant reminder in that book was, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't force the horse to drink, right? And so I can share this story. I can share the love of eternal wisdom, as de Montfort puts it. And, his entire book is in my book. It's I got permission to republish the whole thing.
Oh, wow.
The people in my life that when I started naming the wounds, I can't make them acknowledge it. I can't force reconciliations. But it's my responsibility to learn to be okay with that and to move on with my life, and not I've lived so much of my life in the past.
Right. Well, so many people though don't want to share their story and be vulnerable because they think it'll re-traumatize them, or it will be too much for them. But I've always thought that in sharing the story, even in my own case, like where I have, it's been liberating. It's been freeing, not to hold on, like thinking that your story, especially if you're the victim of something, as if you're the one that should be carrying that shame. But in telling the story and having people actually receive it, suddenly shame can be lifted and there can be freedom to be had. Does that resonate for you? Or
It does. And what I find is the stories that I thought about all the time that just lived on constant repeat, which is, part of the disorder, part of PTSD, right? It's just always living. That they're just kind of flittering away like dreams a little bit. Like they're not going away. But they have lost a tremendous amount of their strength in my retelling. And so the book part has helped that, right? I felt like even in all the EMDR stuff that I was doing, I was still having to relive a lot of these things over and over again. And I was really glad after I wrote the book. I was worried that I was like you said, I was going to breathe new life into it. And what's interesting is when people ask me questions about the book or specific stories I told in the book, I have found I have to think a little bit harder. I'm like, oh, hey, man, let me remember. Whereas before it used to be like, it was right there on the tip of my tongue, and I could tell you about that story immediately without, and so that's been an interesting thing and an odd thing, right? Because, interviewing and promoting the book, I'm supposed to be able to whip these stories out left and right. But for me, I'm like, oh, I'm really glad I forgot all about that. Because that's, some of these are wounds that like I couldn't go, from like childhood sexual abuse or other types of abuse that I experienced, bullying and that kind of thing, where it just it impacted my actions with my current day relationships with people. I would react as that kid, and I just never could see it until like the last few years. And so that's been a big fruit of like when I see myself reacting in the past way of being able to go, oh, I don't have to react that way anymore. I don't have to engage in this contentious conversation that's been on a repeat for 10 years, either with myself or with others, right? I mean, sometimes the worst arguments I ever had were with myself, and I always say driving or in the shower. Those are the worst places that I have conversations with myself or, with others.
Well, I love what you're saying, because that is what we're talking about. It's post-traumatic growth. So it's, you just named some traumas. You just named things that were playing in your head over and over, inner conversations that were really unhealthy within. And yet in telling your story, and you mentioned EMDR, and just in case anyone doesn't know, that's a trauma treatment, experiential trauma treatment that I happen to love and practice. Yeah. But, in doing the therapy and being vulnerable with your story with safe people and so on, you've experienced greater freedom from all the, the effects of post-traumatic stress in your life.
Yeah. And it's still a work in progress. And I find myself, I ask my therapist on a regular basis. I'm like, when I first signed up for this, like, everything I had read and researched, it made me feel like this is going to be a couple months and I'll be good to go. But if it's a series of complex traumas built upon each other, it takes a while, right? And so, but I think it's, and I tell people all the time, this is my trauma, not yours. So I can't tell you what your experience is going to be like going through, the healing process for this.
Right.
I hope it's as good for you as it has been for me. But, I can imagine if it's a singular incident, it would be a lot easier to process. But, in my case, and this is what I outline in the book, it was a lot of layers.
So you had complex trauma, right? Complex trauma where people that are close to you hurt you in various ways.
Yeah. And that happened a lot. Over the course of decades. And then when I started to, a big part of my forgiveness journey was just myself. Right. And that was, how is it that I'm this guy who's been doing Catholic media for so long? And, I could stare in the mirror after all that and talking to God, say, you hate me, right? You hate me, God. And to believe that, and to have to come to it, what it was like, obviously, sin makes you stupid. It's one of my favorite phrases. Having to come face to face with forgiving myself for the sinful behavior that I did, and realizing that a lot of the sinful behavior, not excusing the sinful behavior, but seeing the cause of a lot of it was my reaction to the trauma I had experienced before. And just what I was trying to seek, right? I was trying to seek proper forms of love. I was trying to seek proper forms of acceptance. I was trying to be seen properly, but I did it in dysfunctional ways because I had never been taught the proper way of doing those things. And so wanting to and needing to forgive myself and say, listen, I only knew what I knew. And I can't keep being angry at the 13-year-old and the 17-year-old and the 21-year-old and the 35-year-old version of me. And, that's part of what the PTSD was for me as well, was carrying the baggage of each of these traumatic periods of life as if I still have to carry them. And so, part of the healing, at least for me, hasn't been an instantaneous thing. It has been a slow releasing of the baggage, and then over time realizing that the baggage is lighter. And I'm fine with that. You're right. I mean, I would have loved to have like first EMDR treatment, everything been washed away, and I walk out going, woohoo, everything's great. But I'm fine with the fact that it's taken me 5 years. I'll say this also, one of the fruits, and this was a special grace that I feel like I was given, but I feel like I can share this with other people to encourage them to take this on. So take this theologically as far as you want, but I ended up back in therapy because of going to confession. And one Saturday I walked into confession and I was feeling, this is in 2021, I was feeling the overall ache of the previous few years and how I just felt like I was doing an army crawl just to get by each day, just army crawling through each day, barely getting through, because the weight in my brain of all of these things was so heavy. It had gotten just insurmountable. I'm carrying a lifetime every day. I'm not living the day, right? I'm not living today. I'm living every day. And it was just too much. And it came out in a confessional, and priest is not a therapist.
Right.
I always try to be super concise in confession. And this is why I say it's a grace, because even though I was being super concise with what I was confessing, the priest is the one who picked it up.
Mm-hmm.
And the priest interjected and asked if I was in therapy.
Oh, wow.
And the priest is the one who said, okay, if you're okay with this, and he was very, very gentle. He said, if you're okay with this, here's my recommendation. This was not my penance. This was a recommendation. He said, I recommend that you look back into getting into Catholic therapy again. And then here in the Atlanta area, we're blessed with different Catholic therapist groups. And so I reached out to one. But the other thing that he said, and this was what was critical, he goes, and I encourage you, at least for a while, to go to weekly confession. And he said, can you do that? And I remember both of us sort of taking a deep breath, and I'm like, yeah, I can commit to that. I can do that. Now, fortunately, I had enough theological background to understand what he was recommending here. What he was recommending here is not, hey, obviously from what I'm hearing, you're a terrible, terrible sinner on the other side of that screen. What I heard was, you need to avail yourself of the grace that God gives in the sacrament of reconciliation. And if you avail yourself of that grace is a healing grace. That grace can help you overcome the hurdles in life. And there have been times where I have been more regular in confession before that, thankfully. So when he recommended it, it was a no-brainer, right? I call that like a well-duh moment, like duh, of course I should do that. That makes a lot of sense.
But I love the fact that he was asking for both. He was asking, for the grace from that sacrament, but also therapy. Like that he saw those as complementary, because that's what we're trying to promote with the Elijah Institute as well, is just what is that healthy integration. So to have a priest say, hey, you might consider therapy.
He also said in the confessional, and I can't remember if it was that same confession or if it was one of the subsequent ones, because I think it was one of the subsequent ones, because I think I said to him, like, you told me to do this, and just to let you know. And then he said, okay, just so you know, I and a lot of other priests, we try really hard, and this is something else I knew too, right, to not remember what is said here. We block it out. He said, so and again, this is the direction to me. I want to be careful that I'm not telling everyone who's watching or listening right now that this is exactly what they need to do, and be succinct, right? Be mindful of the priest's time and the time of the people waiting in line. But he said, give a brief accounting to the priest before you give your confession. And so I started to go into confession and say, bless me, Father, for I've sinned. It's been X amount of time since I went to confession. I was diagnosed with PTSD in 2018. I've been in therapy since then. I struggle with this, and this. And here are my sins. And so he knew that, right? And so in my case, at the time, I had worked for a couple of archdioceses. I had some issues with a few priests that used to be my boss. And so I also included that. I explained I've worked for the Catholic Church for 20 plus years. I've worked for some priests. I struggle sometimes with other priests as a result of that. Here are my sins, right? Give some context so that the priest can work with that, but be brief. I got to be really strong on that.
Can we take just a moment and talk about St. Louis de Montfort, because I'm a big fan of saints and mystical saints, but I tend to focus on the ones in the first millennium and then the medieval period. Sometimes I'm not as crazy with the ones in the like 18th, 19th, early 20th century. I don't know. And St. Louis de Montfort was one that I struggled with, just the style.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he's just like too flowery or something. I haven't looked at his stuff for a long time, but I feel like I need to revisit him. But you already just did. So like how would you say St. Louis de Montfort's message was? Like, what is his message about healing from trauma or about post-traumatic growth? I mean, obviously he's not going to use those words, but what would you say that his message was that relates to the psychological issues?
So this ties into EMDR in many ways. Let me try this. And I share this story in the book. After I'd been going to EMDR for a while, and in particular, the incident of there were a couple of neighborhood boys that had sexually abused me, and I'm not exactly sure of the age. I was 4, 5, 6 years old around that time. And so obviously, that's one that was deeply buried, and that I was really surprised when I started going to EMDR. That's the thing that kept coming back. That was like a source, right, for a lot of other things. And after some time of reprocessing that moment and desensitizing that moment, I was in EMDR, and I don't want to say I had a mystical vision. It wasn't a mystical vision. It was an image came to mind during EMDR. And the image was I was in this basement where the abuse happened, and everything was dark. And I couldn't see any light in this room, but I knew where I was. And then the Blessed Mother was there in the room, and it began with just a pinpoint of light. And then she was radiant. And again, I want to be very clear. I'm not saying I wasn't having a vision. This is not an apparition. This was in my mind. And I saw her getting brighter and going to all of the shadow corners of the room. Mm-hmm. And the areas of the darkest blackness in the room were illuminated. Mm. And even those two boys, and whatever pain had happened to them, to have them do something to another innocent child. Mm.
Wow.
They were illuminated.
Wow.
And she took me and lifted me out. We went through these double doors that entered into it. And that door got sealed up and then was gone. And the one window was sealed up and then was gone. And she took me to the middle of this cul-de-sac near where there was a drainage ditch. And we're just standing in the middle of the cul-de-sac, and she just lifted up my chin upwards. And everything was white.
Wow.
Everything was clear.
Wow.
Everything was clean. And all the pain was gone in that moment.
Wow. That's beautiful.
And to me, de Montfort shows us that more than anything, he wants us to entrust our lives to our Blessed Mother so that she can lead us to Jesus. Years ago, I had a priest tell me, and it was at a retreat, he said, sometimes when you're having difficult times, he says, I like to look back and ask Jesus, show me where you were at that time. And this priest, he was so positive, and he said, and then Jesus will tell me exactly where he was in that moment. And I just wanted to punch the priest in the face, because I was like, I've tried that, and I can't see where God was when I'm being sexually abused. I can't see God where he was when I was being physically abused. I can't see God where he was when I was being verbally abused. I can't see it. But after that moment, and looking at de Montfort tells us that at the moment of the incarnation, when Jesus came into this world, long before his own incarnation, at the beginning of time, he knew that we would exist. That Jesus Christ is eternal wisdom, right? So that title, the love of eternal wisdom, is the love of Jesus Christ. And if he knew that we would exist before all time, and he knew at his incarnation when he came into this world, and he knew when he was on the cross, and he knew at the resurrection, and he knew in his ascension into heaven, and he knows even now that we exist. He has been chasing us and has had a purpose for us at all moments of our lives, including in those moments. And I couldn't see Jesus in the moments when they were happening. And sometimes I couldn't even see him when I would ask him to reveal himself. But as I've sought healing, I have found more and more that I can see how clearly he was present, in that he is a God that works outside of space and time. And a strange thing that I do now that I have never done before I started to experience post-traumatic growth is I started praying for myself at those periods of time. Dear God, please bless and protect and be with that 6-year-old or that 5-year-old. Please be with that 12-year-old the first time he thought about suicide. Please be with the 17-year-old when he put that gun in his mouth. Please be with that 23-year-old when he was betrayed by someone he loved in a relationship for the first time. Be with that 48-year-old when he feels his entire world crumbling underneath his feet. And he will still answer those prayers. By the fact that, Gerry, you and I are talking about this right now. And so Jesus acts outside of space and time. And de Montfort tells us that in all periods of history, eternal history, salvation history, that Jesus has a plan for us. And so in the love of eternal wisdom, he tells the full story of Christ in all of these various stages of Christ, before the incarnation, at the incarnation, after the resurrection. And what I was able to see for the first time was I could tell my story chronologically. And again, I had tried to tell it many times and I failed. But when I started to map my own story chapter by chapter to de Montfort, I was able to see how Christ's plan from incarnation, or before incarnation to after resurrection, my life maps to that. And that was, for me, why I love de Montfort. But de Montfort's big thing, to go back to my first story, Jesus came into this world, chose to come into this world, desired and designed to come into this world through Mary. And so if Jesus is eternal wisdom, Mary is the seat of wisdom. She is the seat that Jesus chose for his throne to come into this world. And so we go to the throne, we go to the king. The throne always points to the king. Mary's seat of wisdom will always point us. And that's what de Montfort's core message is we can grow closer to Jesus Christ. We can possess eternal wisdom, have Jesus Christ possessed in our lives, because we go to Mary, who will give us Jesus again, just as she gave Jesus to the world. And so that's de Montfortian, theology. It's all based upon the love of Jesus Christ. And so, in many ways, he's better known for his, book, True Devotion to the Blessed Virgin, or The Secret of the Rosary. Well, he wrote The Love of Eternal Wisdom first. And the last chapter of The Love of Eternal Wisdom is the first place he points out the clearest, easiest, best way of possessing Jesus Christ, eternal wisdom in our lives is through the hands of his mother and through consecrating ourselves to her so that she will bring us Jesus. And that really is him in a nutshell. Now, the flowery language that you talked about, you're absolutely right. He was writing as a, early 1700s Frenchman. And so his French was then translated, and there's different translations that some are better than others. Okay. And so that's also a consideration, right? It's like you're always reading a translation. And so I like the one that is in this book, but it's not easy. And I tell people all the time, it's like, I've reread, it's a short treatise. I mean, even though my book is ridiculously thick, most of it is just me going on and on about my own stories, right? But his story, I've reread this book at least 12 times while writing my book. They're short chapters. They're nuggets of wisdom that I say take one chapter at a time. Just take it to prayer. But if you know the narrative in advance that he's going to take you from that salvation history perspective, it makes it a lot clearer. I love this book so much. I I needed to tell this story so that people would discover Louis de Montfort's love of eternal wisdom. Like
so
I
you've
did.
mapped like in this book, you've mapped your story with this book and how they align and how it.
Yeah.
Well,
it's literally chapter by chapter. I write an essay, and then it's a chapter from de Montfort, and my essay, and then de Montfort.
So you get
the
that
whole
book
story
out of your book too, the 2-for-1.
Yeah.
But I'm really interested in this idea of like narrative therapy. I don't know how familiar you are with that, but it's an approach, a type of therapy where you do look at your life story with a new lens. You can't change history, of course, but you can change the way you see your story, and in time.
And I'm really curious to hear you talk about this. And I just, before you do, I want to throw out, I started to read, I read about half of a book before I went back into therapy. Someone had recommended a book called Upside, which was the first time I ever heard of this idea of narrative therapy. And so that's an area that I haven't, I think I accidentally did narrative therapy.
Right.
But I'm really curious to hear from you. What is that? What does that mean?
I mean, that's not my primary mode as a therapist, right? Of narrative therapy, but I love stories and I love storytelling, and I do think narrative therapy allows you to visit the different life, your life events, and be able to see the resilience that you had or you displayed, even despite the pain and suffering and difficulties and challenges, and you start to see. It's from a secular point of view, narrative therapy, it wouldn't be focused so much necessarily on obviously God's work or Mary's presence or anything, but you do start to see how more of a strength approach, and how you can now tell your story as one where you've overcome or where you've gotten through something. And so even if you think about, I bet you and I could both talk for a long time, like hero's journey stuff. And even if you think about a movie like Star Wars based on hero's journey, I mean, every hero, or Odysseus from, all these heroes, they all are wounded, right? They always have and they're always isolated or something's wrong and they have a wound of some kind and they have to go through a journey. They have to find friends. They have to fight a dragon. They have to overcome something. And then they get to that at the end of it, some sort of cosmic marriage or some sort of reconciliation, right? And so the idea is the story of our lives is kind of a hero's journey. And so to me, narrative therapy is kind of fun and exciting, and to be able to kind of retell your story. But when you add a dimension, the Christian dimension, in my view, I mean, God is the author of all story, right? Even Christ is the Word. He's literally, and eternal wisdom, like you said, or not you, well, you, yes, but Saint Louis de Montfort, and and so this notion that our story is being told is part of this grand story that is salvation history.
Yeah.
So it's all story, and there's a lot going on, and I might get the names wrong or say it wrong, but Dan Allender Center. And they've been doing story work, I think it's called. And there's some Catholics that are doing, a lot of good Catholics I know are doing that program, being trained in it or going through the program. And I believe it would be a narrative approach to healing trauma.
Yeah, I'm always attracted to storytelling. I mean, my whole dream growing up was to be, a novelist. And I always had hoped that would be what I'm doing full time. Now, thanks be to God that He's led me in a different path. I'm still able to write, right? But I can't help but write, even though at the worst of times, when after I was diagnosed with PTSD and for the first several years after, I was not able to paint. I was barely able to draw. I couldn't write anymore. I lost all interest in those things, and so I'm very, very grateful that desire to write started to come back. But telling my story and writing it, my favorite parts of putting this together were, I love it when I'm writing fiction or nonfiction, and I go back and look at something later on, and I don't remember writing it, or it's something that I wrote that particularly impressed me. And the reason why I say it impressed me is because it's normally in those moments that I don't remember writing it. Those are the things that impressed me the most. That tells me the Holy Spirit was showing up and guiding things. And literally, I think it was my second book that I had published. I remember when I got the printed copy, I'm always terrified that like a comma splice or some error is going to get through the book that I missed, right? That I'm a little bit perfectionist when it comes to media production stuff. And when that book came out, I remember sitting on my front porch reading it, and I read this paragraph and I went, oh, the editor had to have added that. And I literally put the book down, got up, went inside the house, found my computer, found the original draft that I sent to the editor, and it was in there. I was like, I have no memory of writing that paragraph.
Right.
And so to me, those are Holy Spirit moments, right?
Yeah.
And I felt like in this book, that happened a lot, where memories came up as I'm reading the Montfort stuff again. And I'm like, I don't know how to match my story to this part. And then all of a sudden I'd just start writing and something would happen. And stories that I either forgot about or I refused to tell. And that was normally my sinful stuff, right? It's like, I think this is the time. I mean, if you've ever read St. Augustine's Confessions, he wasn't a good dude, right? He was a terrible person. But now he's a saint that we revere years later, centuries later. Part of it is because of his journey, that narrative journey of this wounded person who needed a friend, and he got that in Hippo and his mom, and he's done amazing things. And so I decided that and also in the middle of this we get a new pope who's an Augustinian pope. I'm like, that to me was, like I said earlier, if I'm gonna write this, I'm gonna swing for the fences. I'm gonna share it transparently. I'm gonna throw it all out there. But sharing the stories in it was an exciting thing for me when I started to see such close connections to de Montfort to my own tale.
Wow.
That when I started seeing that was very exciting because I saw the Holy Spirit at work, right? I saw that connection. Plus, you'll appreciate this. I got to tell the story for the first time. I feel so. I always joke, and as I did at the beginning about the podcast, Rosary Army was the first Catholic organization to have a podcast. I feel like I'm the first Catholic author to successfully work in both Captain Carrot and His Amazing Zoo Crew and the Saga of Swamp Thing into a Catholic book about a 300-year-old saint.
Wow.
I was very proud of that fact
impressed.
that they had to put in Captain Carrot, even with the exclamation point at the end of Zoo Crew. I worked it in there. It's so like little challenges like that were fun for me too.
I remember that I earned my geek cred with you when you showed me something, a pen or something, and said, "Who's this?" And I said, "I think that's Captain Carrot." And
that was my
that's phone. What it is. Yes, that's right. And I'm like, because not everyone would remember that.
Yes, I had no respect for you until that moment.
That's right. That's fantastic. Well, yeah, you mentioned St. Augustine. Yeah, and I mean, I think it's chapter 7 and 8 of the Confessions where he has that whole experience under the fig tree where he literally enters into what I would call a therapeutic zone, right? Where he's literally having this experience, where he's talking to Lady Chastity, and there's these different voices that are haunting him, and then there's that little boy that shows up. That's like an EMDR session, right there.
Yeah, I never thought of that. That's really cool.
Yeah, I wrote an article about that in For Souls and Hearts, and it's like he and then he has that cathartic experience of just crying and just unburdening all of that, all the pain, everything. And it's a surrender ultimately to God. And he does all, and Augustine says this, right? And it's all in the context of his story. So it is that the Confessions is a kind of narrative therapy in a way. If we can enter into it too, we experience something of it. So I love that. Yeah. And just also just to quickly mention too, because the story you shared a moment ago. And by the way, thank you so much for your vulnerability and honoring me and any listeners to hear what you've shared. Thank you. But when you had that experience in EMDR with Our Lady, and she was bringing the light to all those corners, and even to the ones that had harmed you, and all of that, what I love about that is that this was not something the therapist engineered. And it wasn't even something you went in planning. It was something that you were in a therapeutic process, but because of your openness to the Holy Spirit, grace was allowed to work, and God was allowed to do something beautiful in that moment. And I love that so much better than when a therapist tries to like make a spiritual thing happen. I don't like that at all. I think that would turn me away. Yeah. But instead, just having being as a Catholic therapist, I'm just open. I don't force or engineer anything, but I'm open to the possibility, especially when the client or the patient is their resources. It's your resources, it's your faith and your faith in Christ and your faith and love for his mother that allowed him to work in you in that moment. And as a Catholic therapist, when those kind of events happen, I'm just honored. I'm just honored to witness it. It's just beautiful. Because
if I, as a non-therapist, as a patient, I would encourage Catholic therapists to approach it the way you just said, and know, at least for people like me, the biggest benefit to me is, again, we live in the South. I've spent a good portion of my life having to defend being Catholic, right? Just like if they see me holding a rosary, man, I'm under attack. Going into, a Christian bookstore and asking for the section on Catholicism and hearing for or against it. It's like, and if I say for, they say, well, you'll need to go somewhere else for that. I have been defensive most of my life about my faith because of the things that people come at me all the time. Going into therapy, I didn't want to have to be defensive if faith was a part of my healing journey. And, I said this just on a podcast my wife and I recorded the other day. I don't know how someone gets through the worst of the worst without a faith in God. I can't comprehend it. Just this past week, and I don't know when this show will go live, but this is one of the things we talked about on our show. It just wounded me when two celebrities took their lives this week. And when I read that news, it made me so incredibly sad. And it wounds me every time I hear of suicide, of course, but it wounds me because it just makes me wonder where their relationship was with God, and if a relationship like that even existed. Because I don't know how I would have made it this far were it not for, again, and I think about how I pray now for those versions of me in the past and how Jesus is responding to those versions.
Mm.
And so I would encourage someone, if you don't have that relationship with Christ, not only to invite him in, but to ask him to bless those times of the greatest amount of woundedness in your life.
Yeah.
Because he knew that those would happen, but he also knew that this moment would happen as well, when you would invite him in and allow him to begin healing now.
Yeah. Well, I love that. And I'm moved, and even the secular world has recognized the importance of spirituality in our lives, even just that much. And that, even in the psychological world, like that, it used to be taboo, like 30 years ago or something. It used to be taboo to talk about spirituality or religion in psychological centers or anything. And you would almost not hear about it, or very rare. And now it's even the Harvard study on human flourishing is recognizes the importance of our spirituality and our faith, and it's included in part of human flourishing is our spiritual growth, and so for Catholics, like, our relationship with God and our faith is actually a strength, not a liability, when it comes to our mental health, when it comes to our whole holistic healing, our whole human flourishing. It's actually crucial. It isn't. We have to be careful, because sometimes we could ignore the human side of it and ignore what the mental health needs are, and just come up with a spiritual answer for everything, and that's a problem. But what we really strive for is to work in the human realm, right, and be open to effective treatments, like we talked about today, EMDR, narrative therapy, looking at effective treatments that have been proven to be effective, and then grace builds on nature, and then grace can transform that and make that even greater. It can actually, strengthen that whole person, that person in new ways. And that's what really excites me, is that integration of the whole person.
Yeah. It's made a huge difference to me to be able to sit there, and if God wants to show up in the middle of therapy, he's allowed to, right? That's not going to be held back. One of the things that came to mind as you were just talking and how things have changed in the realm of psychological practice is the first time I ever went to a therapist was after a suicide attempt when I was 17. And that therapist, I felt like, did more harm than good in that therapist, what's so funny, and I share that story as well. It was actually our parish priest drove me to this therapist every week. He volunteered to do that as a favor to my parents.
Wow.
So this is back at a time where a priest could do something like that. And that priest made a huge difference in my life in that he helped me process what he felt like the therapist was trying to say, but was unsuccessful in doing so. But that therapist was, he wasn't helping me to come to realizations on my own. He was telling me certain things to do. Like at that time, there was a girl that I was a junior in high school. She was a junior in college. So she's basically a young adult who was making overt sexual advances, and we were engaging in a lot of things that I was uncomfortable with. That therapist encouraged me to pursue that. Like he flat out was telling me, I think you should go out with that girl. You should pursue that girl. And I'm like, but I'm telling you, I don't want to do that because I think it would be good for you. And that's
bad
right.
Therapy.
So it's the
all round.
It's the 1980s. It was. I don't.
It should have been bad for the 1980s.
Well, I'm just telling you, it's like that. I bring up that story for people who are watching that might have had a not so good experience with therapy.
Right.
Of don't let one bad experience derail the rest. Right. It's like when I hear people talk about leaving the Catholic faith because of a priest they didn't like or someone they didn't like. I'm like, well, listen, even Jesus had Judas. You don't leave, Peter because of one bad egg. It's like that doesn't make sense. Right. So I say that about kind of that was a lesson that I had to learn when I went into that intensive outpatient program in 2018. I was going in very jaded, having tried several therapists over several years and never finding help. So I had got to the point where I'm like, there is no help.
Right.
And that was whether that was a lie of the devil or if that was God protecting me because he needed me to get to a point where, again, all of these things come together, right? That might have been the case. So I just encourage people not to give up on it.
Yeah. And what we're really trying to do, even at the Elijah Institute's trainings, for example, is to marry effective, good treatments, right? So therapists shouldn't have an agenda, right? And shouldn't be pushing something, right? And should be attuned to the person. So to be able to be attuned to the fact that you were uncomfortable, right? And yet they were pushing you into something. But aside from that, even from a Catholic perspective, right? So a therapist who's, holding their faith, I mean, they can't do anything, you're not going to judge somebody if they're making, poor moral choices or whatnot, but they're not going to encourage somebody into to take part in something that would be harmful, for their spiritual well-being.
And that's so important. Yeah. It's just, I can't tell you it was a balm that I needed, right? When I started in Catholic therapy, to just be able to know that wasn't going to happen, that I wasn't going to be, and if I needed to talk about a negative thing I did, I wasn't going to be judged negatively.
Yeah. That,
if anything, I was going to be, supported in seeking proper reconciliation and the sacraments, that kind of thing. And that was huge for me. That was so huge. And it was such a comfort. And it allowed me to let my guard down in the way that I needed to let it down. It allowed me to have that level of transparency, to have that level of vulnerability where healing can actually begin.
No, I love it. I'm so glad to hear that. Well, we're probably going to be wrapping up pretty soon. One thing, we touched upon it already, I think, quite a bit, but maybe just to mention, right, in terms of human flourishing and different models of post-traumatic growth, meaning making is so important. And that relates obviously to spirituality, but meaning making, like if you look at your life and you just think, oh, every day was a waste and what was my purpose of my life? And you have some sort of existential crisis, right? Like that's dangerous spiritually, and it's dangerous for one's mental health. So I know, if you can say something about, what your book offers, what St. Louis de Montfort offers related to meaning making as a central part of post-traumatic growth.
Well, I would say that I have spent a good amount of my life trying to earn my value, right? The work that I do, if I just work hard enough, if I do enough big things, then that will give me meaning. And I would say that de Montfort would say, eternal wisdom, Jesus Christ would say, I have meaning just because God willed me into existence.
I love it.
And that's, it's easy to say, well, that's not enough, but it's enough for God. So it needs to be enough for me. And in many ways, and again, this is something that we were talking about before recording, this whole thing has been humbling in the best of ways, right? Dealing with these kinds of things. It's knocked me down where I needed to be knocked down so that I could be at the level that God wants me to be and help the people that need to be helped at this level. And so the meaning that I'm finding now is, I would say that rather than trying to earn validation anymore, I have my desire to work now is more akin to just wanting to throw as much spaghetti against the wall and see what's going to stick to help people, if that makes sense. Like I want to do a lot of work. I'm not going to be overly concerned over every single thing that I do. I'm a lot more experimental in the last year or two of like, let's see if this will help someone. Let's see if this will help someone, rather than this is going to be the end all be all thing that I could be doing. This is the greatest, and this will get people to like me. I've just stopped doing that. And I'm willing to like make a lot more mistakes and throwing a lot more things out. And if something doesn't work, move on. Man, if I can get someone to read de Montfort's Love of Eternal Wisdom, and they would experience the love of Jesus Christ in a real way that they didn't have to earn, because it's freely given, then that's tremendous amount of meaning.
Yeah.
It is my hope and my dream and my goal, even though if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But I wrote this book as an experiment to see how many people can I get to re-embrace de Montfort in this book that no one knows about, right? They'd all know about true devotion and everything else. No one knows about the love of eternal wisdom. If I can tell my story, my 21st century Augustine story of sin, and get people to read de Montfort and get them to change their lives, get them to see the benefit of consecrating their lives to Jesus through the hands of his mother. If I can make that happen, that's tremendous meaning. And I am so grateful for all the traumas in my life. If my traumas in the form of this story get people to read de Montfort and experience and discover the love of eternal wisdom.
Wow.
That's the greatest amount of meaning I could possibly have. I said it while I was writing this book. If I were to send this manuscript in and have a heart attack and die the next day, I'd be good with that being my last thing.
Wow. Well, that speaks to post-traumatic growth, because that is a big change in your life where the focus is now, how can God work through me and my trauma to help other people? It's beautiful. Yep. One last question. We'll wrap things up. If that you might have a sense for, I don't know how easy this is to answer, but if Saint Louis de Montfort was here and he was sitting with someone who had experienced a lot of heaviness, a lot of trauma in their lives, and they were still struggling. Oh, well, he is apparently, yes. If somebody's not watching, you just produced a relic, I assume, of St. Louis.
It is. Yeah.
By the way, I was born in the hospital that I was born in Ottawa, Canada, is the Montfort Hospital.
I love it.
I assume after him.
Sure.
A very French-Canadian thing to do.
Yeah.
If he was here with somebody suffering right now, with a heavy trauma burden, what do you imagine that St. Louis might have to say to them?
There is one part in the book where he shares Solomon's Prayer for Wisdom. And we reprinted the whole thing in the back because it's so strong. And so it's not even his words, right? It's Solomon's.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an illustration of the vastness of God's love. I don't think we know the vastness of God's love like we think we do. And de Montfort worked tirelessly to the point where, he walked everywhere. He'd walk hundreds of miles to go give not a retreat, but like a mission somewhere. I was drawn to that prayer, that pray for wisdom, that the love of eternal wisdom is something that Solomon, we just assume God just shows up and goes, okay, here's your wisdom, right? It was that fast. Solomon sought it earnestly. He was willing to do whatever he had to do to obtain it, and then God gave it to him. We need to just seek everything with all of our energy. Seek eternal wisdom. Seek Jesus Christ. Ask for eternal wisdom to be in our lives. That's what de Montfort wanted. The love of God. That we would seek the love of Jesus Christ at all times and relentlessly work towards obtaining it. And the way to do that is by growing in holiness. But he would say, seek eternal wisdom at all costs. All right. Do everything you have to do to seek eternal wisdom. And that's the thing that kind of comes to me. I think that's what he's
okay. No, thank you. I appreciate that. I know I was throwing you on, out of nowhere maybe, but
that's a great question though. I love the question.
Yeah.
So thank you. Yeah. And thank you for giving me a moment to just sort of sit on it rather than having to spontaneously come up with something. That was, I like that.
You're good. Thank you. I love the fact that we just got to see Relic. Just brought out out of nowhere, it seems.
Well, he's right next to us whenever we're doing a recording, and he was with me the whole time I was writing the book. So a listener to our show out of nowhere when we recorded an episode a few years ago, her mother had died, and her mother had this relic for many years. And this woman knew that I had a devotion and sent it. And it was within about a year that I started writing the book after receiving this. So I very much feel like it's been, this is a major part, having de Montfort in he's watching my back. He's literally behind me every day when I'm working. So I get very emotional when I start talking about him too long. I get very emotional. And I've never felt that way about a saint before. But in my book, I repeatedly refer to him as my dear friend de Montfort. And I do consider him, he's one of my best friends ever.
I love it. I feel that way about St. Maximus the Confessor. Most people don't even know who that is. But I love it. And thank you, because I had read The Secret of the Rosary. I think that's the only one I had read many years ago. And so you've made me interested in St. Louis de Montfort again. So I'd like to look at it, especially Eternal Wisdom, which I haven't read. So I look forward to reading your book, look forward to that integration. Greg, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about this and telling your story and honoring us with your resilience and your vulnerability and your love for Christ and his mother. Thank you so much.
Appreciate the opportunity, Gerry. Thank you.
God bless. Well, thank you for joining us. I hope you'll join us again for Post-Traumatic Growth with Dr. Gerry Crete. Today we heard the story of one man, Greg Willits, the author of God Doesn't Hate Me After All, which you can get at Sophia Institute Press, as well as on Amazon and other places. And we heard his story of grace. This one man's story of being met by grace, by Mary, by a love he didn't think was for him. If something in Greg's story stirred something in yours, trust that. You don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to be willing to be found. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time on Post-Traumatic Growth.